My cousin borrowed $17,000 from me to start a business, but instead he used it for travel and gambling. When I took him to court, my entire family sided with him. Recently, he approached me again asking for another $7,000 for a business investment. Since he already owed me $3,000, I initially refused, but my parents pressured me into agreeing. He promised to pay me back within 6 months, claiming he would have his business up and running by then. However, 6 months passed and not only had he not even started his business yet, but he had actually spent the $7,000 on himself. He went traveling in Asia, bought a new gaming console and gambled the rest away. I remember the day he came to me about it with both his parents and mine by his side. He claimed to feel terrible about how he wasted the $7,000 and wanted to make amends. To do this, he asked for another $7,000 loan, promising that this time he would start a business. I couldn't help but laugh, and as I was about to refuse, my aunt interrupted, insisting that family should support one another. She began pushing me hard to lend him the money. Old memories flooded back of being ganged up on, with my parents, aunt, uncle and brother looming over me. Ultimately, I let them bully me into giving him another $7,000. As the months passed, my cousin Darren never paid me back. I gave him another 6 months and then I started pressing him about the total of $17,000 he owed me. Unsurprisingly, my family defended him, insisting I was overreacting and needed to be more patient. This lack of support was all too familiar. The differences between Darren and me had always been stark. I remember working long hours at a diner at 16 to save for my first car, taking every extra shift I could, while Darren never had to work at all. On his 16th birthday, our family threw him a lavish party and presented him with a brand new car topped with a giant red bow. It wasn't just the car that bothered me. It was the way everyone treated him like he deserved everything. Meanwhile, no one seemed to recognize the hard work I put in. When I finally saved enough to buy a used car, there was no celebration. It felt like my hard work didn't count. Darren casually mentioned crashing his car while racing with friends, and instead of being upset, my family laughed it off. My uncle even wrote him a check for the repairs. If I had been in his position, I would have been grounded for months. It was always the same when Darren struggled in school. They hired tutors and blamed the teachers. When I had difficulties, I was just told to figure it out on my own. Darren had everything handed to him while I had to work hard for what I earned. The family viewed him as special, while I was simply expected to manage on my own. My mom always told me to be patient, insisting that Darren had consistently come through for the family and would do the same for me. Sure, Darren had helped family members before, like paying off my aunt's overdue credit card and covering my cousin's rent when she lost her job. Everyone loved to highlight those moments as if they made him a hero. But what they conveniently overlooked was that Darren never had to worry about his own bills. My uncle always took care of his car payments and my aunt paid off his credit card debt when it got too high. With his college tuition fully covered, he never faced the stress of budgeting or choosing between paying the electric bill or the rent. He could afford to throw a few $100s at someone occasionally, but no one had ever lent him anything close to the $17,000 I had. That was a whole different story. He was always the one offering help, never the one in debt. No one had ever asked him for anything this significant, and now that I had, he couldn't handle it. So, I gathered the family to confront Darren about the money in front of everyone. As I looked around for support, all I got were blank stares. My dad shrugged while Darren sat there, smug with his hands folded, acting as if he had nothing to answer for. Then my aunt, the one he had helped with her credit card, broke the silence. She accused me of overreacting and insisted that family wasn't just about money. She claimed I was causing a rift over something trivial, saying we'd all miss each other if one of us passed away. She loved to pull that card, but this wasn't about that. I needed my money back, yet she treated it like spare change. I had worked hard to save that amount, sacrificing nights out with friends, putting in overtime at both jobs and budgeting every meal. Here was my family acting as if it was no big deal that Darren had taken my hard-earned savings to fund his lavish lifestyle. I reminded them that he promised to pay me back, and it had been 6 months filled with nothing but excuses. Darren leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and repeated that the money was tied up, just as he had been saying for months. He promised I'd get it back with interest as soon as his deal went through and asked me to trust him. I had trusted him, but every time I asked for an update, he had a new excuse. Meanwhile, he was out living his best life while I wondered if I'd ever see my money again. Before I could respond, my uncle, who had been silent until then, expressed his disappointment in our behavior. He claimed Darren was doing something good for the future of the family, suggesting that in a few years, the $17,000 wouldn't matter when we were all wealthy, and I should feel proud for helping him out. My stomach dropped at his words. I realized I was just wasting my breath with them, and it was clear my family wouldn't support me. So I decided to take matters into my own hands. Over the next few weeks, I stopped attending family gatherings. Just the thought of seeing them twisted my stomach in knots. I began gathering evidence of Darren's spending habits. I suspected he was using the money for luxury items, and while his Instagram posts were public, I needed more concrete proof. So I started digging deeper. I looked into public records, tracked his purchases, and investigated his so-called business investments. What I discovered confirmed my suspicions. There was no business. Darren had used my $17,000 to buy a luxury car, take extravagant vacations, and furnish his apartment with high-end furniture. The tech startup he claimed to be investing in didn't even exist. Faced with this information, I decided to consult a financial investigator. It was a difficult choice, involving a stranger in family matters, but I felt I had no other option. The investigator tracked Darren's spending further and provided detailed reports that outlined exactly where my money had gone. As I reviewed the final report, I felt a strange mix of relief and anger. Relief that I finally had concrete proof, but anger that it had gone this far. My plan was to present everything to my family, hoping they would finally see the truth. When I called for another family meeting, I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I thought the evidence would persuade them. I was wrong. Sitting around the dinner table, I presented everything. The investigator's report, public records, and screenshots of Darren's lavish spending. I even created a timeline showing how, from the day I loaned him the money, he had been using it for personal gain. At first, the room fell silent. I expected shock, maybe some apologies for not believing me sooner, but what I got instead was disbelief. My mom insisted it couldn't be true, claiming Darren wouldn't do something like that. Darren tried to brush it off, saying that some of the money went toward business expenses and that spending on himself was just part of the process. He argued that looking successful was essential for actually being successful. His tone was casual, as if he expected everyone to accept his rationale without question. It felt infuriating to hear him twist the truth like that, especially after I had presented solid evidence of his misuse of funds. I confronted him again, stating that he had taken my money under false pretenses and used it for his own gain. "That's fraud," I said firmly. The word hung in the air and the room tensed. My father's face flushed red, my uncle shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and my mother just stared at Darren as if waiting for him to provide some magical explanation. Darren tried to explain himself again, insisting that he needed to invest in himself too. He admitted he got carried away but promised he would pay back every dime. But the damage was done. The evidence was undeniable. Darren had lied, and now everyone in the room knew it. I felt certain I had him cornered. It was like I was playing chess while he was still on checkers. Yet despite everything they had seen and heard, my family continued to side with him. They refused to fully hold him accountable. My dad, rubbing his temples in frustration, urged me to understand that Darren was under pressure and just trying to make something of himself. "Mistakes happen," he said. But this wasn't a mistake. Darren didn't accidentally take my money and forget to pay it back. He lied, took what I worked hard for, and had no intention of returning it. Then my mom gave me a sad look as if I was the one in the wrong. Instead of siding with me, she suggested I should have given Darren more time. "He wouldn't hurt you on purpose," she said. Her words stung more than I expected. How could they still see him as the victim? I was the one left in the lurch, yet they acted as if I was the problem. It wasn't about giving him time, it was about trust. And Darren had shattered that. My uncle let out a heavy sigh, and for a moment, I thought he might finally understand where I was coming from. But no, he simply reminded me that family was more important than money. They didn't want this to tear us apart. I stood up, feeling the weight of it all. I couldn't keep fighting them or pretending everything was okay any longer. The next day I went to my lawyer and filed a lawsuit against Darren for fraud. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the only option I had left. My family had chosen to protect him at my expense, and I wasn't about to let that slide. I had worked too hard for that money to let it go without a fight. Once my lawyer served him the papers, I knew it would likely lead to my family disowning me. The lawsuit turned everything upside down. Darren, who had been avoiding me for months, suddenly couldn't stop calling. He begged me to drop the case, promising he'd find a way to pay me back. But betrayal was something I couldn't easily forget. He was in the process of paying me back, which allowed me to put a down payment on my first house and even buy some new furniture with the interest. But during that time he would lash out, accusing me of ruining his life. I wasn't buying it. I'd heard his excuses too many times before. My parents were furious, but it wasn't about the money for them anymore. To them, I was the one tearing the family apart. So I refused to back down. The court proceedings dragged on for months, with Darren's lawyer trying to paint me as the unreasonable one. During the trial, I was shocked when my uncle took the stand to defend him. He claimed that the money I loaned Darren was given in good faith, not as a loan but as family support. He argued that Darren had sought investments from other family members too, as if that somehow justified everything. According to my uncle, I was one of many who had offered financial help because starting a tech company requires significant capital. I remembered Darren asking me to be part of it, and my uncle portrayed it as a noble venture, insisting that it was all for Darren's future. But the truth was, none of the others had actually given him money. That crucial detail was conveniently left out. The narrative painted Darren as someone doing the right thing, while I was framed as having misunderstood the situation. But the evidence was undeniable. I had all the messages proving he promised to pay me back. Alongside the investigator's report, Darren's spending records, and his own inconsistent testimony, everything pointed to one conclusion: fraud. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor. Darren was ordered to repay the full amount plus interest and faced fines for his fraudulent actions. While I had hoped the court's decision would bring closure, the reality was that my relationship with my family was forever changed. They offered apologies once the ruling came through, but those words felt empty. When it truly mattered, they had chosen Darren over me.